Hey, WordPress KC. Tonight we're going to be talking about creating accessible content on your WordPress website. My name is Travis Flans. I am one of the WordPress KC organizers, and we're here tonight with Jerry Jones. And I want to apologize to Jerry because when we're talking accessibility, we're live streaming on YouTube, which does not have automatic captions transcribed for live videos unless you have 10,000 subscribers. So hit that subscribe button so we can get over the 20 person mark and get closer to 10,000. So I will just let Jerry take control here. I will be running the comment section on the YouTube live stream. So introduce yourselves. And if you want Jerry to take a look at your website later, drop the URL in there. And welcome, Jerry. I'll let you take it away.
Hey, y'all. Yeah, like Travis introduced, thank you so much. I'm Jerry Jones. I work at Automattic as a JavaScript engineer and also as kind of like an accessibility, not expert, because I still have a lot to learn, but a kind of like accessibility consultant, more or less, where if the issues aren't full-on accessibility expert level, they usually get passed on to me so I can take a look at them so I can keep learning. But so for today, I was going to talk about creating accessible content with WordPress. A lot of the content too a lot of this presentation isn't just about WordPress. It's stuff that'll be relevant for any website that you work in. But the things that are applicable to building, add those things or do those things in WordPress. But yeah, in general, these rules apply to any website that you're making. Yeah, so, and also this is trying to be a no code base. So you shouldn't have to be digging into too much HTML or PHP or anything about like building WordPress on the code level. You should be able to just manage these things via like the block editor in WordPress. So yeah, here we go. First off, not really about content, but themes, because with themes, a lot of people look for an accessible theme, or sometimes I help out with the accessibility, like making WordPress channel, and we'll get questions about what theme is accessible. And there's a distinction between themes and the content. So themes are not actually accessible. It's not that they're inaccessible, but a theme doesn't have content. So a content is a thing that you go to for the website to actually access. So a theme could be made accessibly, but the content within it could be inaccessible. And so the distinction there that's important to remember is just because your theme was built accessibly doesn't mean that your whole website and the content you put within that theme will be accessible. And so we'll be talking today about the content within that. But when you do look at themes, you'll look for what's called accessible ready. So to build on that point, it's ready. The theme is built accessibly as long as your content is accessible, then you'll have an accessible website. And the rest of the presentation won't be this mincing words too much. But I just wanted to get that out of the way about themes, so that we had a distinction between what we're talking about with a theme's accessibility versus the content. Because when you actually go to test a site, only a site with content can be considered accessible or inaccessible. One thing to look for, kind of like a flagstone item of a site that was built accessibly or considered it, is what's called a skip to content link. I'll play this GIF or GIF here, and you can see it pop up really quickly up here. You see the skip to content. That is a little link that skips the long heading that, like, if you have a website with a whole bunch of navigation items, you can just use your keyboard. You can just press tab to move the focus indicator. And then when you hit enter on that, it'll skip you past all the heading and right into the content. And that's really helpful for websites that have a really huge navigation. So that's just, yeah, an item to look for if you are evaluating a theme, that if it has that, there's a good chance that they at least considered accessibility. Okay. So moving on to the actual content. A few quick tips before we get into some more details. These are just very general content considerations, is to when not use a whole bunch of emojis, because there's a software called Screen Reader that visually impaired, or actually I kind of like using one even though I'm not visually impaired too much, even though I did go to the eye doctor today and could not see the sign at all without any glasses. But if you are using a screen reader, we use the word announce. It'll read the text to you or announce things to you. And so this don't use lots of emojis. When we're reading it visually, you can just kind of skip the claps and it adds a little bit of funny emphasis. But if you're using a screen reader, it would be something like, don't hands clapping, use hands clapping, lots hands clapping, of hands clapping, emojis, hands clapping, which isn't a great experience. So even though sometimes these formats can be fun to use, be conscientious that it might annoy some people or be a bad experience for some people. Another thing is multi-word hashtags. If you capitalize them so that it's easier to read visually, it's also a screen reader can designate where those breaks are in the hashtag. So this tweet that I saw just the other day about Black Lives Matter is if it's hashtag all lowercase, I tested this out today. It tries to read it as one long word. That doesn't really make sense. But then if you capitalize it, it will pronounce it more correctly, be able to designate the Black Lives Matter whole. It'll be able to designate each of those words. So little things like this can make a big difference for a screen reader for those announcements and the experience that they get. And one of the most important things, headings. I guess there's many important things, but this is a very simple one that can make a huge difference on your website, is knowing how to use headings correctly. And it's not too difficult, but you can see here, this title, this page, I'm a heading. That's what that is. And headings, they give your page structure, and I'll explain that in a little bit. It gives you, I like to think of it as like a book, or like the title of the book would be the most important heading. In HTML, we have different rankings of headings. There's the H1, which is the most important. There should only be one H1, and it'll be the most important thing of the entire page. And then underneath of that, like a chapter title would be an H2. And then a subsection within that chapter would be an H3. And it can keep going down until H6 is the least important one. And when building and working with websites, you really, I can't remember the last time I used an H5. H1, 2, and 3 are very common, but 4, you don't really reach for very often. And then by 5 and 6, you're hardly ever going to see those. But the reason that these are important is on a screen reader, you can navigate by heading, actually. So in some screen readers, there's a couple different ones. There's Safari VoiceOver, or VoiceOver is what's on a Mac by default, and that goes with Safari. And then on Windows, there's NVDA and JAWS, which are two different ones. And NVDA is usually used with Firefox and Windows. It's a free screen reader you can download. And NVDA specifically, you can just press H and it'll skip you to the next heading level that you're at. So it's a way to get an overview of a page. Some people will just kind of skip and look at all those headings in order to get an idea of what the page is about. And then in Safari with VoiceOver, I'll show a picture later, but there's a thing called a link rotor which you can bring up. And there's a few different ways to navigate that way. And one of them is a heading list, where it'll show you all of the headings of your web page. And so what's really useful for that, it's kind of like a table of contents from a book, right? It gives you an idea of what content you're accessing. So for example, if I were to do this presentation as a heading structure, the title of it, Creating Accessible Content with WordPress, that would be my H1, the most important one. Underneath of that, we talked about themes and accessibility. So you can see the H2 nested a little bit there. It's giving some structure. We talked about the skip to content link. That was under the heading of themes and accessibility. So you can see the structure starting to form. We have the content as an H2, because that's outside of the themes and accessibility. And the next one would have been headings. If you don't use these heading levels, then your you're kind of like, you're lacking the structure that you could be having, because there's a lot communicated just through that structure. Here it is without it. If you were to just use paragraphs or divs is another thing. If you remove all those headings, now not only do they not even have the semantics, is what we call it, of those headings, but now everything's just in a flat list. So there's a lot that can be communicated just by using that right, or the correct heading level and the correct HTML tag. To do this in the block editor, there is the heading block. I'm sure if you've worked with WordPress for a little bit, you've come across the heading block. It's a pretty crucial one. And you have the heading block. And there's the H2 and the toolbar, the block toolbar, as well as in the block settings. You can see the H1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. You can select whichever one you want. A page by default will be an H1. So like if you go to your, to like the blog post, for example, or it will be the title will be an H1. So generally you'll use H2 and H3 within your actual content. So when I'm creating content, I would generally use an H2 for my titles within the article. And then there's a really fun one that I like using to make headings quickly. There's a little shortcut that you can use the semantics or the little hash tag or pound sign, and it will create the levels for you automatically. So 2 of those, it'll automatically create a heading 2 block. 3 of them will automatically be a heading 3, and 4 of them heading 4, and so on. That's how I generally create my heading blocks. It's easier than searching for the block and then selecting it, and it's just kind of fun to do. Next is images. So if you see on here the text there, a purple slug on a red rose, and the little broken image link that we see sometimes, that's usually the only time visually as a sighted person that you will come across the alt text. And the alt text stands for alternative text, I believe, I guess. And it's the description that is read that a screen reader uses to communicate what an image is. And if you don't use alt text on your images, it'll just read whatever the file name is, which isn't usually helpful. So mine are usually like screenshot and then today's date, which isn't a very good description of what the content is. So it's really important that we write alt text on images. And we'll talk about this a little bit because writing alt text can be kind of hard. So 2 quick things. Every image that you use, this actually isn't a total. There are some times that you would not use alt text, but in general, you need to have alt text for an image. Or if you don't have it, you need to understand the consequences and have a good reason for why you're not having alt text. So in general, when you're adding content, you're using the WordPress editor, you're going to want to use alt text on an image. And then really quick, a point to use is to not use images of text. Unless, like on Twitter, this happens all the time, where people take a screenshot and there's an image, but then and this was just me, I thought I want to try to find something on Twitter because I see this all the time. And it took me like less than a minute, and I saw these 2 right next to each other even. It happens all the time. If you ever do this, you actually can on Twitter add alt text to an image. And you can add the entire text of the image. That is acceptable, I think, for Twitter and social media, but on your website in general, just don't use images of text, especially like headings and things, which was kind of like an old school way before CSS and custom fonts got powerful. Like when I started out a long time ago, people would use, like for headings, they would use the actual like exporting the image of the text of the heading. It's just not a good look anymore. And you have to provide you lose the semantics basically unless you do a lot of extra work. So in general, don't use images of text. But I've never been that great at writing good alt text, even though I want to be really good at it. It's hard to do sometimes. And so I've tried to get a lot better at it. I'm still working on it. But I asked on Twitter because I was having a hard time with it. And even though I'd read a bunch of articles, sometimes it's just, easier to have someone explain it to you if that's an option. So I asked, what are some favorite tips for writing good alt text? Because, it's hard to understand between writing not enough and too much. And so the advice that I was given, which I felt like was really helpful, was be descriptive but succinct. 1 to 3 sentences max. If you're writing more than 3, there's a good chance that you're kind of going overboard. This is a really important one that was super helpful for me, is to highlight the important details in the image that are relevant to the page content. So what this means to me is that it's not just an image. You're not just describing like the metadata level of like every single thing that's in the image, but you're trying to communicate why this image is there and how it adds to the content. Like, what do you want your reader to get out of that image? Why did you put it in there? And that should be present in the alt text. That was a huge thing for me in my understanding of how to write good alt text. And then a tip, which I would do before, was starting it with an image of, or a GIF of, or a GIF of, because it's obvious. And I knew this from using a screen reader, but you know that it's image because it tells you. So it's not useful to do that. And another thing that was helpful was the telephone test. And that's where you imagine if you were to call a friend up and just blurt out something simple, would they get an idea of what you were talking about? So the one that I heard was a purple slug. Like, pick up the phone and then say a purple slug and hang up. And the person that you talked to, that you called up, would get the idea that, okay, they're talking about a purple slug. But for me, I might imagine that on like a white background or something. I see the purple slug, but I don't really know what's going on. And then if you just extend that even just a tiny bit and say a purple slug on a red rose, then for me, at least, it fills in the rest of the image and gives me a lot more context. And so just a little bit extra detail sometimes can make a huge difference. And so I put together a little game for us. It's not a super fun game, I'm sorry. But the idea is select the alt text. So I'm going to have like an A, B, C, and D. Over here on the right, we have our content image and then the start of our story. So say this was in the context of a story of going on a trip, and we started it off to describe it of the mountains were crisp and clear as we wobbled in our cable car high above the land. And then there's this image. So A, and you can go ahead afterwards, we can take a moment, look them over, and you can throw if you feel comfortable, no one's going to judge you, we're all learning. You can throw in which one you think is the best, or which one you would select for it. So first off, image containing mountains, clouds, cable cars, trees, blue and white with small houses, photo taken from above. So that's a very like meta level detail. B, mountains in tiny cable cars. C, beautiful view of the mountains as we traveled across the land in cable cars right before we passed through the clouds. D, cable cars about to travel underneath the clouds with large mountains in the background. I think this one's kind of tricky. If I didn't choose the answer, I would probably have a hard time with it. So as you're thinking it over, I can start talking through it as well. This A option is one that you'll see a lot from, you'll see a lot from stock photo libraries. They'll often use artificial intelligence to analyze the image and take out all of the pieces of it. and just give you a very metal level detail of what's going on. So yes, it is an image containing mountains, clouds, cable cars, trees, blue and white with small houses, photo taken from above. There's all those details, but it doesn't really add to the story. I'm seeing a lot of C's and D's, which are definitely good options. Mountains and tiny cable cars, it gets you the idea for sure. And I think it could be acceptable alt text in certain situations. But in this instance, I think that it's not quite enough. That there is more that relates to our story. And then C, beautiful view of the mountains as we traveled across the land in cable cars right before we passed through the clouds. I think this is the one that I actually wrote with the intention of what I would think of as the answer for this alt text. However, D is also really good. The only thing that I think makes C a little bit better is that it has more context in relation to this little piece of story. Admittedly, this isn't a great question because there's not a whole lot of content here to get the idea of what the content of the story is. But I think that this communicates what it is from within the context of the story. That said, D, cable cars about to travel underneath the clouds with large mountains in the background, I think is a great generic alt text for this image. And what I mean by that is, like, if you were to just add this image to any website, I think that would be awesome alt text. But in context of the story, I think C would be a little bit better. And with that, actually adding alt text in WordPress. So actually going back to this D, this cable car is about to travel. If this was the image we were adding, I would add that in the alt text here. I would add that D generic, like, good alt text here. Because when you upload an image to the media library, you can add the alt text there. And anywhere you insert that image, that alt text will be used. However, when you insert the image into the editor, you can see this image alt text here as well. And it will automatically insert whatever you had saved from your media library, but you can overwrite it with a more specific alt text for your story or your content. And when you save that, it will only save it for the image within this content. It won't save it for every time you use this image. So that allows you to both use use a generic alt text like D, like that option, while also within certain contexts overwriting that and using one that's more specific to your content. Sorry if that was a little convoluted way of describing that, but you're able to use both a generic and a more specific alt text. Links. Also, if you have questions about images or anything going, I can always go back. I'm happy to answer questions in the midst of things or as they come up, or I can do at the end as well. So feel free. So links. I see links written incorrectly all the time. And it's not just you'll see this everywhere after today. So I apologize for making you see how often this comes up. And now from here on out, you'll know that this is not the right way to write links. You should avoid generic phrases like click here or read more. And I'll explain a little bit more in a second. There's an image I have to help illustrate it. But linked text should describe what the link goes to. And it's okay if it's even a little bit longer. But if you write click here and link that text or read more, it's not describing what you're going to see when you click on that link or when you or what you're reading more of. And I'll go over these next 2 points. very quick. Opening links in a new tab, in general, it's not a good idea, especially from within your content. If you are going to have a link open a new tab, you should have a very good reason why. And having it just because you don't want them to kind of like leave your page isn't, which is definitely something clients would tell me before, that wasn't a good reason. So it needs, most of the time there isn't a great reason. And the reason that it's not a good idea is when you're using a screen reader, opening in a new tab isn't often announced. And so if you know, like opening a new tab, that breaks your back button. And so if you click back on a new tab, it doesn't take you anywhere. And if you're using a screen reader and it didn't like specifically announce that it was opening into a new window, or maybe you just missed that context, now you're in a new area without the ability to go back to where you were easily, which can be really confusing. And part of what you were wanting to do often by opening a new tab is to allow people to go back to where they were easily. But with a screen reader, this makes it far more difficult. And it's often super confusing. So in general, it's just better to not use them. And the next thing is text links should not just be a different color. Well, that's something. They should always be a different color than the body text, but they should also have another indicator. And underlines are the best way of doing that. Some people use bolded text, but it's not as accessible. So leaving those underlines on the body content links are really helpful and makes it have better accessibility. But going back to the avoid generic links. So here is an image of the link rotor from VoiceOver that I talked about the rotor in VoiceOver before, where you could navigate by headings. Well, you can also navigate by links and get an idea of all the links on a page. And so this is a convoluted one that I made up here to demonstrate it, but this does happen on websites where every single link is just click here. And if you're on a screen reader and want to see the context, it's not very helpful because your links should demonstrate what the content is. And so imagine instead that didn't say click here, click here, click here, click here, click here, but it said buy now, or upcoming events, or all of our available properties. Even though I don't have any kind of website that you're on right now, when you see those links, you have an idea of the context that you're going to, just by the text that is being linked. And so even though it's very hard to get out of it, using click here is an easy way out. I'm just going to give you an idea that it's not going to be easy, even for me sometimes. When I'm trying to write a link, it will take me a few minutes to think up how I should write it in a way that describes the content that it's getting linked to. So be gentle with yourself, because if you're used to writing click here a lot, it's going to be hard to get out of, but it is something that you can do, and it makes a big difference. Colors. So something similar to the underline and using the link as a different color is using color contrast. This is, if you see the WCAG, WCAG is what they say. There's a AA level when you're evaluating or auditing for accessibility, which is kind of like the lowest that people really take as like an acceptable level. And then there's the AAA, which is kind of like the gold standard. If you meet AA, which is what WordPress is trying to meet for, WordPress core is trying to meet for all of its releases, you're going to be in great shape. If you meet AAA, then you're like over the top. I don't know if I've ever seen a website that meets AAA and everything. I pretty much just stick to trying to do AA because it's already kind of hard enough. But so color contrast is, if you can see this, can people read the text? So the white here, and the color contrast title, has sufficient color contrast, which means it's easier to read. But then as the text fades out here, I made the colors more and more similar to this blue background. And that does not have sufficient contrast, so it's more and more difficult to read. Over here, where we have this minimum, is the minimum contrast ratio. And there, if you Google where do title attributes come into play, in general, I don't actually have this in the presentation, but
sorry, I missed that one when it came up.
oh, that's fine. I can't remember the specific reason. I think it has to, but basically the advice that I've always read is just don't use title attributes. That they're generally, the title attribute, I don't remember why it made it in, but title attributes are just considered inaccessible in general because they are cursor centric, so to speak. You can only access them via hovering with a mouse cursor. So like in the title attribute, what we're talking about with that is like, if you've ever seen the webcomic like XKCD, I think is the name of it. That comic is someone that uses the title attribute on images a lot, where if you hover on the image, it'll like he kind of like reveals a joke that will come up as the title attribute. And also, if you read that comic, you know that it's not, if you ever tried to read it on your phone, you know that you do not ever see the title attribute because you can't, you don't have a cursor to hover it. And so in general, title attributes, they just say don't use them because of that. You can't access it with a keyboard or a screen reader. But yeah, so this color contrast, you can see here the 5 boxing wizards jump quickly, this part. That is this 767676 color on a white background. This 4.5 to 1 is the lowest ratio that will pass level 2 for normal text. So if this was your body text, yeah, this would be the lightest possible like pure gray color that would pass. But this is still not super acceptable. People will use it for like hints and things. But any lighter than this is definitely not going to be acceptable. This 7 to 1 meets the AAA. And for body content, I would definitely recommend having at least 7 to 1. Even higher is better, even 8 to 1 or higher. But as long as it's dark enough to be easily readable, you should be okay. But be wary of seeing this light text. And if you Google like color contrast checker or yeah, you'll see tons of tools. There's even like Google Chrome plugins that can analyze things for you. I didn't really link to one because I feel like I use a different one every time I Google it to check it out. And I don't feel like there's a best one. So Google it, explore them a little bit, and see which one you feel like makes the most sense to you. The things to look for are that it tells you a foreground color and background color, so you can check what you're actually looking for, and if it will tell you if it passes the AA or AAA, and it'll also tell you the actual contrast ratio. So that's an easy one to look for when you're evaluating a site, and an easy thing to change too. You can always just make the text a little darker. When you're talking about colors with color blindness, and also a lot of things in accessibility are what makes something more accessible for someone with a certain disability also enhances things for everyone else. And this is a good illustration of this. And another illustration of that is like Siri or Alexa. A lot of those voice command things were developed with accessibility in mind, or like being useful for people with mobility issues. And as a result, we have all, like any able-bodied person has benefited greatly from that technology as well. So often disability technology is kind of on the cutting edge, and we're kind of later to take that on. But in terms of color blindness, the tip is to not rely on color only. And this is another convoluted example of someone with no color blindness would have the first name field and it has a red check mark because it's empty. The last name is filled in and has the green check mark. But if you have like a red blindness, which is a form of red-green color blindness, it would look like this. Both these check marks here, and I used a check mark because people do sometimes use a check mark to like, I mean, if from grade school and things, you would use a check mark for an incorrect answer. And so that still shows up on the web sometimes. A lot of people use an X. But for this example, you can see that both of these kind of lose. If you don't have red blindness, then both of these are both kind of like a muddy greenish, yellowish color. They lose their difference between them. And so it's hard to tell what one means. However, if we don't rely on color only, it makes it better for everyone. So if the top example, no color blindness, we have the first name is not filled out with a red check mark, but then underneath of that it says your first name is required. So we've linked this up so that even if you can't tell these check marks, like on the bottom part, how they're both still that muddy yellowish greenish color, it still says your first name is required, and you can see, you can access that visually, or a screen reader would also announce that. And so by not relying on color only to communicate things, you're making things more accessible for everyone. Last one is cognitive accessibility. So I think the best illustration of this one is the bottom. This no timers is something that comes up sometimes on like big sales websites, where they're saying like you have like this much time to act to try to like encourage people into doing something. But if you have a cognitive disability, the timer might not allow you to really assess everything you want or need to assess before making a decision. So basically, cognitive accessibility is making things easy to understand, and bulleted lists help a lot. Short sentences and smaller words. Bolding and bolded text there doesn't mean bold all text on the page, but highlighting, using bolding of text to highlight certain passages or certain sections of your content in order to highlight what you like really want someone to see. And then don't autoplay anything. And this is not only a cognitive accessibility thing, but I'm sure as a user of the web, you have run into an issue of a website starting to play something, and it was like maybe 3 tabs ago, and you're searching around for which tab to figure out is playing. So it's not a great look anyways, but it also isn't good for accessibility reasons. Last section of this is, so we've talked a lot about the content of the accessibility, but it's also, I think it's very helpful to be able to evaluate, like if you're looking at a new theme or a plugin or something, to see, did they build it accessibly? And without having to like dig into the code level and hire an accessibility consultant or something, like how can you get the idea that that someone has built something with accessibility in mind? And you'll be surprised too on how quickly, like this, I would use this technique for evaluating plugins a lot to see if people built a plugin with accessibility line without like, because I mean, there's usually like, 20 plugins for whatever it is you want to do. And just being able to use a few techniques, you can weed that down to 1 or 2. Usually I would be left with only one possible option. So, because most developers do not develop with accessibility in mind, unfortunately. So this is my put together the 5-minute accessibility audit. This is what I would do to run different plugins or different code through. And if they pass this, then they got put onto my short list to evaluate more later. But yeah, it's a really useful way to weed out a lot of things. So the first thing is keyboard interactions. And what I mean by that is, can you navigate the website or the plugin, whatever it is, using just your keyboard? And for a sighted person, this will generally be, if you're not using a screen reader, you'll usually just need tab, which will skip you to the different links or buttons. And then the arrow keys up and down are usually all you need, or maybe right and left. And like for like a radio button, like a radio button group, you'll tab to it and then use the arrow keys to move between the elements. So tab and arrow keys will get you pretty far. Zooming on my Mac, it's just Command plus and Command minus. Command plus to zoom in, Command minus to zoom out. Actually, I have these slides. I don't know why I was going through all of them there. First one is keyboard navigation. And I talked about that, tab focus, arrow keys, and the skip to content link will show up too. So here's my Twitter. You can see these. This is the focus indicator, that ring that's hopping around that shows you where you're at on the page. And the focus indicator is, like, if you don't have a focus indicator when you're tabbing to show you where you're at, then the site automatically fails that part of it, and that would go to the next site. And this was something that was super common before. It's still super common, but there were a lot of CSS style sheets and things that would remove outlines entirely from the entire website. And unfortunately, that was common practice and is still very common practice. I'm sure you won't have to look far to see the focus indicator not being present, not being visible. The zoom, like I was saying, Command plus to zoom in. I'm sure it's different on Windows. If anyone knows, they can chat to tell. And then to reset, you can press Command 0. What we're looking for here is, does the site reflow in order to accommodate the zoomed in text? Because part of accessibility is being in the browser. What's so amazing about it is that people can customize how they want to access the content. And so if you need the text bigger, zoom in some. And if the website still works really well, and then that's great. A lot of times too, this will be just fine. Thank you, Control minus and Control plus. Because of responsive design, which is a term you've probably heard if you have looked at themes, most sites built with responsive design should be able to handle this well. Labeling inputs, this is another one that you'll see a lot, and from here on out, you can know that they didn't build it well. So this left one is actually Spotify's. You'll see this on huge websites and small websites. This form is definitely not built right. We need to label inputs, and what I mean by that is on this WordPress one is your email address. That's considered the label. It labels what the field is for. These here, when they have like this lighter text within the field, like email, confirm email, password, that's actually considered what's called a placeholder. And so there was a time, and it still happens, where designers felt like these labels were ugly, and so they decided just to put the label as a placeholder. But the issue with a placeholder, well, one, it's kind of lighter text, so it's harder to read. It doesn't really pass our color contrast. And a label is considered something that has to have sufficient color contrast. So it fails because of that, or just from what we know already. But also it disappears after you click on it. If the labels are on the form fields but not displayed via CSS. So I'll show you an example in a second. It's that's better because a screen reader, well, depending on how it's hidden, if it's hidden in an accessible way, then a screen reader would still be able to make those announcements. But even for a sighted person using these, the issue is that they disappear. So as you fill it out. So, and also if you are to use a placeholder, the correct, like the W3, the working group that creates HTML, a placeholder is supposed to not be a label, but to show you what you are an example of what you would enter into that field. So for email, like this one, or instead of it being email, this placeholder should be like example@gmail.com. Seems like the issue is also screen readers not reading title, placeholders, stuff like that. They do. I think they can read placeholders, but it's not. I wouldn't blame that on screen readers, as I would blame that on the HTML not being written correctly. Yeah, because it's the browser communicates. So there's this is getting a little technical, but the browser has an accessibility tree, which it interprets the HTML into an accessibility tree, which then the screen reader reads off the accessibility tree, because the screen reader software is not just reading from the browser, but it can interact with your entire desktop. And so the way that the browser is communicating that to the accessibility tree is where that gap occurs. And if you're using a placeholder, then what if you use the placeholder correctly? Then does that overwrite the label? Does that make sense? So like it's definitely an HTML level issue in that context. But so you can see here on the WordPress one, it says your email address. They just don't use placeholder text at all, which is actually preferable a lot of times. You can choose a username, choose a password. It's very labeled. It's clearly labeled. They have sufficient contrast. And over here, so maybe you do remember, since we were on that slide for a long time, but what was that field for? If you don't remember, it's not because you weren't good at remembering it. It's because it should be labeled. If that was on the WordPress one where the labels were above it, we wouldn't have this issue at all. So even though, and this is Spotify's form. If I go back, if you remember, it's what should we call you? It was your name field. Even though when I've clicked through this slide several times I will often forget and still have to go back and look at it, even though I was the one that made it. And even if you do remember, if you think about that cognitive, making it accessible cognitively as well, having that label be visible is much better. So hopefully that does illustrate why it's important. Even if you're hiding it via CSS, it's not just a screen reader thing, but it's useful for many people. So we can evaluate. If you remember at the beginning, we asked for some websites. It doesn't have to be your own. It can be a theme you're looking at, or a plugin, or a major website too. Because there are, like we saw on the Spotify thing, there are plenty of accessibility issues out there. And so if you send a link in the chat, I can use those, the tabbing, the zooming in, looking for the labels, any of those things that we went over here, link color contrast. And let's just check out and see what we find. So if you do have one, send them on over. And while we're collecting a few of them, I can go over something else, but I'll wait a minute. And I think there's a little bit of a delay, so sorry if you're sending stuff and I'm not seeing it quite yet. I can appsumo.com. Okay, so the first thing I do is just start hitting tab. Okay, I've hopped way down the page where I can see a little bit of a focus indicator here. This blue outline is hopping to the image. So these things are good. It has the browse all deals. That's good link text. To learn more, I can maybe see it being acceptable if there's context with it, but I'd like to see it more specifically, like if it had Nifty or StubHub in there. Ooh, look at this, an input that is unlabeled. Actually, though, if it is a 1, this is maybe unfair, because a search field can sometimes have an unlabeled text if the button clearly relates to it. So this may be able to pass, but I would rather see the label there. But I don't know what happened at the beginning here. Why did we hop way down the page? Looks like their menu is not accessible. So if they wanted a keyboard user to access their main menu, it's not in the tab, what we call the tab order. So I wouldn't be able to access these with the keyboard, so it would fail. We can try the zoom. Yeah, it goes to its responsive state. So that's good. You can see if these restack. Yep, it does. So that's fine. And then the color contrast seems pretty good. This one is maybe not sufficient. Here, we can try it out. Oh, whoops. And feel free to send another website as well. So let's see, we have the color. Huh. Oh, it's white with an opacity. That's going to be trickier to calculate. They didn't have this as a specific hex key color, but a white on opacity. This one's definitely passes. And the color contrast looks pretty good on it. And we already know what the lowest is of this one. 8282, that passes. So yeah, that one's good. KansasCity.com. All right, let's try that. Like I said, this doesn't take very long to be able to see pretty quickly that there are some issues going on there. I'm just using the tab. So, hey, look at that. Skip the content link. But clicking on it doesn't seem to do anything. I think it's trying to take me to a new page. Okay, well, they tried on that. We'll just try it again. Okay, now I'm at the bottom. Accept cookies. So I hit enter. Enter and spacebar are what we use a lot of times for accepting something. So we can close. Oh, here's an issue. It's a little bit. This is pretty common too. What's called a focus loss. So when we click the sections, it does move us into this close button sections. However, get back to it, sorry. When we close the menu, it should return the focus to where we were. But I'm not sure where we are. So rather than returning it to the section button so we can continue on, it dropped us somewhere else. So when we close that menu, it should bring us back to the same state. I don't know what these do. With the search. You see that it did open the search when I clicked it, but it didn't bring me to the search. I have to tab through all these other things to get to focus the search. So what this tells me is that semantically, those things are not connected. If they should be next to each other in the HTML, or if they're not, then when you click that search, it should focus this search input for you. But it does have the focus indicator, which is good for part of it. But a lot of times, like, it's very tricky to see the focus indicator. Like, I'm not sure where I'm at right now. I think I'm on national. And then the image, like, I'm focused on this image here, but it's extremely hard to tell that I'm focused there. We'll try the zoom. So the keyboard focus outline is really, and just trying to use the website with a keyboard will tell you so much about a website. So this is kind of still, this looks pretty good still when you're zoomed in. Does anyone else have any other websites? We can keep looking around here too. Trying to see for any forms other than the search. Here, we can check out any accessibility scanner / tools to automate this. There are some, like Chrome has what's called Lighthouse, and it will tell you lots of things. But a website can be technically accessible, meet all of the things, all those items, but still not be actually usable, if that makes sense. So it might meet all of the technical requirements, but it might not be done in a way that actually makes sense. So I think that this tab method is just tabbing through and trying to use something with a keyboard is actually a pretty good way of evaluating it. So let's just go to a page. So this lighthouse in here, we can click generate report. Actually, I don't care about these things. So you can see the accessibility here. It's not a perfect one, but it should give you a pretty good idea. And it'll give you a score for it. But again, it's not the things that come out might not be might not be as helpful to you as actually just testing out with tab. So some elements have a tab index with greater value than 0. Links do not have a discernible name. So let's see, a search icon. Okay, so yeah, this search icon up here, it has a title attribute, but a title attribute, as we were talking earlier, is not accessible because it's very cursor centric. A screen reader won't get that communicated. That link needed to have some kind of text. It could have been hidden, but and usually with an icon, you will have hidden text that explains the icon. Kind of like what we said before about always label. Don't just use a color to communicate something. Similarly, don't just use an icon. It should be labeled, even if it is not visible. You can still code level add labels that are not visible, but that will be present for a screen reader. But also similarly, that label will generally be helpful. Is this maybe a subscribe? I'm guessing this is the weather. I think maybe this is the print edition. I don't really know what it is. E-edition today. They still have the labels, that's good. Yeah, so this has an 81 score, but I don't think that's as useful a lot of times. It's just using a keyboard to evaluate it quickly, because you might not be evaluating what you thought it was. Yeah, does anyone else have a site? Or I can also just move on to the next thing if this gets you the idea. And we can come back to it as well. What are some common accessibility issues when viewing on a smartphone? I think they're all pretty similar. I mean, a common thing that I see is not being able to zoom in. So a lot of websites will fix their website at a certain size and not allow you to zoom out or zoom in. So that's the most common one I see. That is a different thing. Or a lot of times, hover states, they'll rely really heavily on a hover state, such as the title attribute. You can't access that title attribute on a phone because there isn't a hover state. There's just a click state. Yeah. So I'll go over this quick theme fixes thing, because I know that this is something that it comes up a bit. And then we can, feel free to keep asking any more questions, and I can stop and go over them. So this one is an article I read recently, and they used accessible overlays with the heaviest of air quotes. And like we were saying earlier, a lot of the accessible overlay is something that you'll see on some websites that I thought that I had added a screenshot of it, but I did not. It basically is like this interface that you can use to try to retroactively make your content more accessible. So one of the things it will do is any alt text that isn't present, it will try to create alt text for you and add it in there. So it passes alt text. That's awesome. But look at the alt text that it generates. Image contains text, illustration, banner, business, image text. Image contains illustration, vector, like that alt text, even though it's present, so it would pass that Lighthouse accessibility automated score, we can see pretty quickly here that that text isn't helpful as actual alt text. So even though it's present, it's not useful. And that's where that distinction comes in between manually testing it to see. And the quote that I took out from it, and it's down here, is while most plugin solution promise a simple, quote, set it and forget it solution to the risk associated with compliance to accessibility laws, because there are laws that are, and I don't know much about the legal stuff. I just like to do accessibility things because I feel like it's a good human thing to do to make that content accessible. But there are laws that, yeah, can be enforced in certain ways in certain times that could, yeah, like I said, not a lawyer. I don't really want to say something wrong about it. But yeah, there's the quote, is that the reality is that the risk is not reduced, but the risk may be increased because there's evidence that the organization recognized accessibility issues and chose to go with a solution that did not address them. So even though it's easy to just grab a plugin or something that will fix certain things for you, it may actually, one, make things worse or not fix everything, and may demonstrate that you acknowledge that there was an issue but didn't fix it in the correct way. And what we talk about these accessible overlays are that they're like trying to add on accessibility. It's like tack on accessibility. But the best description that I've heard is say you made blueberry muffins. Like you're going to a party and you're bringing some blueberry muffins. On the way there, you're holding them in your lap, someone else is driving, and you're like, oh, did you make blueberry muffins? Like, yeah, I have them right here. And then you realize you did not put the blueberries in the blueberry muffins. So they're just plain muffins. And so you still have your blueberries, and you start shoving them into your muffins, right? Those aren't going, sure, they're technically blueberry muffins, but they're not going to be anything like they should be. You need to bake, it's called baked in accessibility. You need to bake it in from the start. You can't shove it in afterwards. You can still improve a lot of things afterwards, but it's not going to be the same as baking it in from the beginning. And one of the plugins that is available, that this is the only one that I would recommend you take a look at it. Joe Dolson is super knowledgeable. He actually wrote an article and released it today about this accessibility plugin, and that he's really torn about it. If he should split it into two things, because he sees a lot of people use it. He had like, it does have part of an accessible overlay, but he was intending to use it as a stopgap for people to be able to, like, you learn about accessibility, you realize your site isn't accessible. This plugin will automate a lot of things for you and fix a lot of things retroactively, but it's not going to be good as starting from the beginning. And so he was talking about how the intention of the plugin was to make the website more accessible for now, while you build a more accessible website, your next website, which will have accessibility baked in. So it's like a stopgap kind of. But he's extremely knowledgeable. What he says is should definitely listen to in terms of accessibility. And yeah, that's all I have. I have some resources and some of them articles that I wrote in preparation for this talk. So like that accessibility audit, some content creators, importance to HTML. There's another one that came out recently, this complete guide to accessibility for WordPress websites. It's pretty similar. And this is a link to the article I just mentioned from Joe Dolson. He says, reminder, accessibility can't be solved automatically. WordPress Accessibility Day. I forget the date, but there is a like a WordCamp kind of focused on accessibility. And this website here, how to choose accessibility ready WordPress theme and why, is a resource for kind of going over and how to evaluate things and how to find an accessibility ready one. Yeah, so that's all I have prepared. If anyone has more questions, feel free to send them in the chat. I'm happy to keep answering questions or talking over things. Yeah. Not sure why my screen is black though.
Well, if you have any questions, drop them in the chat. But I want to say thank you very much, Jerry. Looks like Jerry's connection may have dropped. So I just want to say thank you very much to Jerry again. And we will get Jerry's slides and I'll put them in the comment section here and in our meetup. So everybody will have them. Thank you very much and have a great night.